Thank you for joining us. This is the meeting for Carpinteria Birdwatchers for July 2024. Tonight's meeting is on two parts, difficult IDs and flycatchers. So part one is difficult IDs with our special guest, Alex Castelein. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, Alex?
It's
Well, and,
Alex
um,
Castelein.
and then part two will be about flycatchers, more of a typical topic that we cover at these meetings. But before we do that, I wanted to share a few quick announcements. This Saturday, we will have our outing for the monthly Carpinteria Birdwatchers outing. It will be Saturday, the 20th at 8 a.m. And we will be meeting at the 8th Street Bridge in Carpinteria. So if you want to be part of that, we'd love to have you come out and just look at carpbirdwatchers.org for more details. And it'll show you how to get there if you don't know. And we'll see you there. Any other announcements? I don't think there's any other announcements. Any burning hot bird news that people want to share before we go on with the meeting content? This is your opportunity to unmute. You're all muted by default. So if you want to talk, just unmute and talk. We're a small enough, well-behaved enough group that I don't think we have to police that any more than that.
I'm new to this group tonight. I'm Kathy. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Kathy Talley from Camarillo.
Oh, great.
I have a pair of Nuttall's woodpeckers in the neighborhood. So that's been kind of fun.
Very cool. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a fun time of year too, because I get a little bored during the height of the breeding season because there's fewer like unusual birds around. Everybody's sort of hunkered down doing their thing in their normal spot. But this time of year, we start to get post-breeding dispersal. So there are birds moving around and you can see weird birds showing up. And that's always fun. Okay, well, I'm just going to move on then to the first topic, which is the difficult IDs topic with our special guest, Alex Castelein. Alex, I posted a link to the nice little profile of you that Santa Barbara Audubon put in their newsletter, but did you want to share anything about who you are, where you're from, why you're a birder in Santa Barbara?
For sure. Can you hear me? Or no? Can't hear me? You can hear me now?
Keep talking. We have this issue where it takes a while to kick in.
Yeah, so I don't know if you can hear me now. No? No, not yet? Okay, sweet. Okay. Yeah, so I'm a fairly new birder. I'm a student at UCSB in computer science going to my fourth year. And I actually started birding at UCSB like a couple weeks into my freshman year when I met my friend Max Laubstein, who many of you know pretty well. And yeah, so I've been birding for almost 3 years now. And I've been pretty obsessed by it for the last two. So yeah.
Yeah, and I will certainly say that, for someone who's only been birding for a few years locally, you've had an outsized impact on the local birding scene. I have chased several birds that you have discovered and shared with the local community. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about. Is it okay if I go ahead and share my screen now and we kind of look at some of those birds? Like we had sort of discussed this in advance, but this is a little bit, figuring this out as we go.
Yeah.
All right, let's go share Google Chrome. And I do want to share sound, I think, and I will optimize for video. Sorry, I narrate everything I'm doing because I can't help myself. Yeah, you want me to restart my application? I don't think that's going to happen. See if we can get by without doing that. Okay, well, we'll just see how this works. And what I want to go to here. Yeah, I know they can see my application. Thank you. Okay, so you in the remote side of the Zoom meeting, can you see this eBird checklist here from Atascadero Creek? Give me a nod or a thumbs up. Yes, okay, great. So this first bird I wanted to talk to you about, Alex, was from a year-ish ago. And this was this Louisiana water thrush that you found along Atascadero Creek. Now, I don't know how many of the people in the meeting are really familiar with this, but there are two very similar water thrush species. There's the northern water thrush and the Louisiana water thrush. And the northern water thrush, which is a very good bird in Santa Barbara, like we see a few of them every year typically, but they're rare. They're cool birds to see. The Louisiana water thrush, which again looks very similar, we like never see or almost never see. So I'm really curious, you came across this bird and you kind of talk about it in your eBird write-up, but I don't want to go through just reading all that. I am curious if you can just share a little bit about your experience of finding this bird, and especially what clued you into the fact that this might be a Louisiana water thrush.
Yeah. So let me know when you can hear me. Can you hear me now? Okay, sweet. Um, so yeah, this one was pretty fun because actually, when I found this bird, I was actually looking for a northern water thrush. Because I've started keeping a list of birds that I've found by myself in the county, and not like chase birds, and I hadn't found a northern water thrush yet, and it was the right time of year, so I was looking for a northern water thrush. And I was biking along Atascadero Creek along the bike path, and I started hearing this little like chinking coming down from the creek, these little call notes. And I thought it sounded interesting, because both water thrushes sound fairly similar. And it had been a while since I'd heard of northern, so I was like, hey, maybe this could be something interesting. And so I found the nearest like access point to the creek and looked down, and sure enough, there was a water thrush down in the creek bed. And I was really excited because I was like, wow, okay, I found my northern water thrush. This is really cool. And like by default, I just defaulted to the fact that it was a northern water thrush and not a Louisiana, because in Santa Barbara there had only been one previous record 20 years ago, and only 23 or so records in the state. So I was like, Louisiana wasn't really even on my radar. Um, but so I saw the water thrush. I snapped a couple of photos and I was excited. I posted to the listserv that I had found northern water thrush. And so I just like fully assumed it was northern. But then I was looking at my photos and I was like, hey, and they were like kind of bad photos. They weren't the best quality. So, but I was looking at them. I was like, hey, like this supercilium is like kind of strong, kind of white, kind of like the streaking isn't that bold. It's an interesting bird. Um, and so then I just like a little inkling of doubt started. And I went back down to look for it again. And I refound it and I got more photos. And I started to get more excited. And so the first thing I did was I started sending photos to other people. So I sent photos to Nick Letheby and Wes Fritz. Many of you know these names. I called Paul Lehman, to try to get myself and I like some people that had actual experience with these birds. And sure enough, as I was on the phone with Call, I was sending him photos. I took a video because like one thing that Paul mentioned that I had no idea about was that the way they bob their tails is slightly different. So I sent him a video, and then so all these things started coming together, and sure enough, we decided that it was in fact Louisiana. And so an hour after I had initially posted that it was a northern, I was able to um, correct myself and tell the listener that it was in fact Louisiana.
I'm going to try playing your video and see the one that's in the eBird list and see if it.
So,
And you can hear Paul in the background of the video talking.
yeah. Some Louisianas, the supercilium flares more behind the eye, but at least on your bird, it stays the same, and it does look nice and white. I'll say that.
Was that Curtis?
No, that was actually, can you hear me right now?
Yeah.
Or no? Okay, you can hear me?
Yeah.
That was actually Paul,
Oh, okay.
on the phone. And so he was like going through my photos and looking at the different field marks.
Awesome. Yeah. So again, I mean, I already kind of said this, but to me, it's just kind of impressive and or kind of mind-boggling that looking at this bird, which, to me, when I first look at it, I think, oh, it looks like a northern water thrush. Cool. But you would notice like little more, like less streaking on the throat area, so more of a white throat. And that supercilium is kind of broader, especially at the back, and whiter, not as sort of buffy or yellowish.
Mm-hmm.
I find that very impressive. I don't know what to say about it, but it's cool. And I was the beneficiary because I was like, whoa, Louisiana water thrush. I remember this bird specifically because I was seeing your updates from the Island Packers pelagic trip that was happening that day. And I'm like, oh man, there's a Louisiana water thrush. And am I going to be able to get there? And I was working out the time and thinking, yeah, I don't think so. It's going to be dark by the time I drive there after the boat gets back. But,
Yeah.
I thought, well, almost looks like I could do it. So I got in the car, after I got off the boat, raced up there, and it was like after sunset when I arrived, and was just lucky. It was running down the path, to the spot where all these people had been seeing it, for during the day, and was lucky enough to run into Curtis Morantz, and he's like, "Yeah, I just flushed up the creek right here." So he basically took me and showed me the bird. So that was really cool. And just in the very last light of day, I got to see that bird.
Yeah.
Thank you to that.
Of course. My pleasure.
Okay, well, I want to keep moving because I want to talk about another, like you've got a whole series of these which again is very impressive to me. So this is your ibis. So this was May of this year at Goleta Slough, so right up there at UCSB, kind of behind the campus police station. And there was a cattle egret there, which was very cool. And there was a group of white-faced ibises, the sort of expected ibis species. I mean, we don't have a lot of them, but we've got a few, and they're always fun to see. But mixed in with them, you were intrigued by this bird, right? So, so take me through this part. Like, what caused you to, question this bird and think it might be something different?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Not yet? Okay, you can hear me. Sweet. So yeah, so I've been coming to this spot a lot recently. Especially like I started last spring, and then especially since Nick Letheby found the little stint last year. And so I pulled up on my bike, I think it was like after class or something. And then I found Steve Caldwell there. And he had mentioned that there were like a couple ibis around. And like 2 minutes after I arrived, the whole group of ibis came in very close. And gave us like a good opportunity to get a good look at them. And like if they were far away, like playing whack-a-mole in the pickleweed like they usually do, like I would not have bothered because they're so difficult to ID. So yeah, these were actually the views we were getting at first, and what initially led me to get interested in this bird. And the other thing I want to mention is that the reason I was like thinking about glossy ibis is, well, partly because there had already been 2 records earlier in the year, in the last 2 or 3 months in California. And so I follow kind of what gets found in other counties and in other areas. And then I'll have like those birds on my mind. And so there were already 2 glossy ibis candidates, and I was like, okay, maybe maybe I can find something here. And sure enough, one of the 6 birds I noticed had a much thinner like border to the facial skin. And so that was the first thing that intrigued me about that bird, and the first thing that I noticed. And then I look closer, and you can see that the facial skin is all like a dark gray color, rather than the pinkish of white-faced ibis. And then get some photos, you look even closer, you see the eye is all dark. In none of the views I had, you could see any red in the eye, which is another point leading to glossy instead of white-faced. And then again, it's not a bird I had any experience with previously. So I didn't know like all the field marks, but I had an idea of like some of the things to look out for. And so again, as I often do when I find something like this, I called up Paul Lehman, sent him some photos, got his opinion on it. And the problem with these 2 species is that they have a high rate of hybridization. Unlike like the water thrush, for example, like that one is usually pretty clear cut. But these guys can be challenging because it's not always pretty clear, even when they're in their breeding plumage, which species they are, and sometimes they're hybrids. And so that was kind of the main problem here. But Paul did tell me like get word out, because this, like, it's, even if it's a hybrid, it's a great bird for Santa Barbara County, because I don't believe there are any records of hybrids or pure glossy before this. And we're still not completely sure, if it's a pure glossy or if it has some hybrid genes in it. And that's going to be up to the record committee.
Yeah. So, which is a really interesting thing for me too. I mean, I'm used to the idea of birding where it's this fun sort of game, and I can keep score, and I can count the species on my list for the year, for the county, or for my life list. But then there are birds that kind of sit between the boundaries that we usually assign to differentiate species. So the California Bird Records Committee, on a very unusual sighting like this, will collect all the photos that people submit, and they'll collect all the information about the sighting, and they get together, is it like once a year or something like that? I mean,
Yeah, so I think they do the main like voting once a year. Like the meetings happen once a year, but I forget if they like circulate the sightings before that. Yeah.
And then it ends up being basically the opinions of this group of expert birders who are sitting on the committee. Like, does this seem, clean enough? Is this like a hybrid bird, or is this legitimately a glossy ibis, ID? And I think you had said in your comments on this checklist that, you pointed out a bunch of previous birds that had been deemed full glossy ibises that, one of the issues was sort of the leg color. Like, this bird's got a little bit of pink around on the legs, not a lot, but a little bit. And maybe that is an indication of hybrid status. But then, at other times, the CBRC has looked at similar birds and said, no, we think that's a hybrid, or at least we're not confident enough to vote it in as a full species. So do you know when you'll find out about this bird, what the timeline is?
So we're not exactly sure. It might be earlier, but it's definitely gonna be by January. So it probably will take a few months at least. But yeah, as you said, like the CBRC has had like conflicting opinions on these birds, and it depends a lot, I think, on who is currently on the committee, because there's 9 people on the CBRC and only 2 of them have to dissent, I think, or it might be 3. 2 or 3 people have to dissent for a record not to be accepted, and for it to be maybe recirculated or something. But yeah, like there was a bird in San Diego in 2021 that Paul was telling me about that looked honestly like a little more pure than this bird, but it was rejected. And then there were other birds that looked maybe even like a little bit more like a hybrid than this bird that were accepted in the past. So it's kind of it's not consistent, and it's hard to say. It's probably like a 50-50 shot whether it gets accepted or not, which is kind of unfortunate, but we'll see.
But also kind of just interesting. Again, like, I'm interested in sort of the culture of birds and birding and very, expert, active, quasi-competitive birders. And it turns out, like, in certain cases, it really is kind of arbitrary seeming, or maybe not arbitrary, but at least it's subjective. Mm-hmm. And so you're kind of at the mercy of this committee. Anyway, well, I think that's really cool. I went, and I was out of town when this flurry of sightings was happening, and I came back in town, and it was still around, I think, or at least it was possibly still around. And I did go there, but it didn't come anywhere near where I was. Like, there was a group of ibises that were well away from the viewing area. Mm-hmm. And I took some photos, and I just kind of I was almost relieved. Like, I think I actually was relieved that it wasn't really close, because I just, with a clear conscience, I could just say, oh, glossy / white-faced ibis. It's one or the other, or a hybrid. I don't know. I mean, I can't tell from this distance. So I didn't have to really wrestle with it and decide, like, was I going to try and claim it or not?
For sure. Yeah.
I guess, but if it had come close, that would have been even more cool, for sure. Okay, then, so there's one other bird I want to talk about, and this kind of continues, this, I mean, it's just sort of an accident that I've arranged in this way. I mean, they're chronological, but I'm going from, what was really solidly a Louisiana water thrush to this, glossy ibis that may or may not end up being deemed a glossy ibis, to your Miarchus species back on June 13th. So last month at Coronado Drive. And you have a write-up here, and I've linked to all of these checklists of yours in the notes for this meeting at carpbirdwatchers.org, and in the description for the YouTube video where we archive the live stream. So if anybody wants to go, read through your summaries in detail, which I recommend, it's really interesting reading. But for the purposes of this meeting, I'm just going to jump in and kind of show this bird. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense of this is that you saw this bird. It looks, a lot like an ash-throated flycatcher, which is an expected species around this time of year. But Miarchus flycatchers, this genus, they are very similar to each other. And there are other species that this might be that are very much not expected here, including this possible candidate of Nutting's flycatcher, right? So you included it, you described it as Miarchus. You said you were going to go back the next day and see if you could get better pictures, because this is just, digiscoped or digibinned through your binoculars with your phone. You didn't have your camera functioning at the time. So tell me the status of this bird. What happened? Did I get anything wrong in that account? What's the story with this flycatcher?
Yeah. So can you hear me? Or
Yep.
okay, sweet. Yeah, so this bird, I'm still not 100% sure what it is. Because it's hard to 100% rule out something like Nuttings. But of course, that's like if it were a Nuttings, that would be by far the rarest bird that we've looked at so far today. It would be, I think, a second state record. And so like it's extremely unlikely. The previous record was a winter bird. There are North American records in spring, but it's just really unlikely species to show up in Santa Barbara. So that's kind of the first thing to mention, I guess. But yeah, so when I saw it, the thing that I guess intrigued me is just the time of year and the location. Just like along the coast like that, I don't usually see ash-throated flycatchers along the coast in June. And so Eddie Mayorkas, I was just, I thought I might do my due diligence and make sure it wasn't something more interesting. Because there's always other possibilities. And Mayorkas visually are, as you said, extremely difficult to identify. And something just seemed like slightly weird about it. So I started, I got my camera out and then I was like, oh shit, my camera's dead, which made it a lot harder for one. And so I started getting some digibin views. But then with Mayorkas, I thought like, the voice is going to be the most important. Like the voice can fully clear it up, if you can hear it. And so what I did is I tried to do some playback to see if I could get it to respond to a number of different species. And so I tried every species that's been recorded in the county plus Nuttings. Just because I thought I might as well. And so I tried great crested, I tried brown crested, I tried dusky capped and ash throated, of course, and Nuttings. And with those 5 species, I tried each of them a few times, and it seemed to respond the most, like pretty noticeably, to Nuttings, which had me a little confused. And then I knew that ash-throated and Nuttings are pretty much impossible to tell apart visually. There's like a few little things, but it's almost impossible. And so I yeah, so I mean the one thing that like the main thing that's different is in the tail. I knew that I didn't know exactly what the difference was between ash-throated and Nuttings, but I knew that Mayorkas are often ideable by their tail pattern if you can get the tail spread. I didn't get the full tail spread, but when it's sitting like this and you can see the underside of the tail, ash-throated should have a black band that goes across the tips of all the tail feathers, rather than on this bird, which has like the middle tail feathers don't have black at the tip. And now juvenile ash-throated do look like this with the tail, while the adults have the full black band. But I talked to some people and it looks like an adult bird. So the tail is like somewhat suggestive of Nuttings, but I never heard the bird call. And it's just such an unlikely species that I kind of just let it go. I did go back and try the next day and I had the same thing. I didn't hear it call again. So it's just kind of one of those birds that just got to let go. And sometimes that's how it goes. Sometimes you don't get enough views. You don't get all the field marks you want to get. And it just doesn't work out. But my guess is it's just an ash-throated, and that's by far the most likely. But who knows?
Well, it's a very cool story. And it's, it's one of the things that's so fun about bird watching is you go out and you don't know what you're going to find. You could find an incredible rarity because the birds move around and they show up in strange places. I'm curious, do you have any, like, again, for me, the most interesting thing about this is the psychology that you didn't like what I would have done. Like, I know what I would have done in that case. Said, oh, ash-throated flycatcher, cool, and just marked it and moved on. What is it, do you think, that makes it, what is it that you have that allows you to entertain this really, out there idea and put in the work to actually determine that, oh, actually, this could be this other bird? Like, is it just that it's so rewarding, like to find a rarity that it's worth it to you to do that, or you just want to know? Like, I'm curious, what is your inner motivator?
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, sweet. Yeah, so I think for me there's a couple things. For one, like I have just a few things about me is like I'm one pretty competitive. Um and two, I like classifying things. Like when I was a kid, I was always like collecting things and like classifying and whatnot. And three, I've always been a huge fan of nature and like reptiles and birds and whatnot. And so those three things together lend themselves pretty well to wanting to find some cool rare bird that that hasn't been seen in the county before or something like that. Especially the competitive side probably. And then yeah, just also I feel like the Louisiana water thrush was my first like solo big find. Because we with Jeremy and Max we found the wood thrush the year before. But Louisiana water thrush was like a little different because it was in a more accessible spot, and I found it like myself, and so and it's like a little bit of a harder ID, so it was like really exciting. There was like that build up, and then people started showing up, and a lot of people got to see it, which was really special. Um, and so yeah, there is that whole aspect of like finding something rare that like you get to share with others that everyone gets excited about. And so like when I'm looking at my Arcus flycatcher that is almost certainly just an ash throat, but might be something cooler. There's going to be that one time where you find you do that due diligence and you will find something really cool if you don't write off all like some weird possibilities. And so I guess that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, I wanted to give an opportunity for people either in Zoom or here in the room if they had questions that they wanted to ask you before we close part one of the meeting. So if you are in Zoom and you'd like to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute and talk, and hopefully you'll be recognized. There is this thing where you need to talk for a few seconds for us to hear it in the room on the room Zoom. So be persistent if you're trying to talk and you're not being acknowledged. And then for anyone in the room, if you want to ask Alex something or just an observation, feel free to make it. That's great. I'll repeat it so that it's audible in the Zoom meeting. So I'm looking around. Maybe everyone is intimidated by your prowess. That's cool. You mentioned the wood thrush. I could have totally put the wood thrush in here too. I was lucky enough. I was on Santa Cruz at Scorpion Harbor that day because it was this, that great fall where there's so many cool rarities out there. And I met you guys coming back down the trail. And you're like, we got a wood thrush. I'm like, oh wow, where exactly did you get a wood thrush? And I was able to go and find it in that was it like lemonade berry or whatever, that patch of bushes along the road there. It was it's not a bird I ever expected to see. And it was a gorgeous bird too. I mean, I only saw little glimpses of it through the foliage, but very grateful to you for sharing that bird, and that I was in the right spot to, take advantage of it. Of
course, yeah.
Yeah, Tom?
So Alex, have you ever done this? Saw a bird, questioned it, and after quite a bit of time, okay, it's a normal bird that I expected. You may have done it.
So I don't know if you heard Tom's question. He's basically asking, have you had this experience of seeing what might be a rarity and you get into it and you get all excited and you check it out and you end up concluding, oh yeah, it's just a normal bird. It's not a rarity. I mean, is that a typical thing for you to experience?
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely happened. I can't think of any like good examples right off the top of my head. Probably the Myarchus is probably the best I can think
Yeah.
of just because it probably is just an ash throat. Um, but there've definitely been birds that I've been gotten like maybe a little excited about, and then it turns out to be something in weird lighting, or it's just it's just something kind of
Yeah.
normal. Of course that
So,
happens. It can be like a little bit discouraging, but it's when you do find that special bird, it's exciting.
so I don't want to put you on the spot about this, but my own personal experience is certainly when I was becoming more avid and more aware of the fact that there are these rarities out there, and it's very exciting when you find one. I was upgrading ordinary birds to rarities and reporting them as rarities. I
Hmm.
was in good faith. I was just not that experienced and was wrong. And fortunately, with eBird and photography, I was able to say, "Oh, here's a photo of the bird I saw." And then, the local experts have been very patient about explaining to me, "No, actually, John, what you saw was this." I've even had cases where I misidentified a hawk, I think, as one species and was corrected, then misidentified it as a second species before finally arriving at the correct species. So I guess if you're persistent enough, eventually you'll get to the right species.
Yeah,
Okay,
definitely.
well, yeah. Did you have something else you were saying?
Um, Sorry. No, I mean, I was just gonna say that, yeah, like
Yeah.
um, that happens, and like there's the whole learning process. And I got lucky that I had Max to kind of guide me, and so anytime I might have, like when I was starting, I might have thought I might have found something. I had somebody to be like, "Hey, look at this picture. Like, is this something interesting, or is this just nothing?" And he'd be like, "Yeah, no, that's not a rare bird. That's just like a,
Yeah, birding on your own is more dangerous because you don't have that check. Yeah, there's a question in the room.
So I was thinking for Alex, is you ever wonder how these birds end up off track?
Yeah, so the question is, do you speculate or do you wonder about how these vagrants end up in these weird places? Like, what do you know about that mechanism, or do you think about that?
Yeah, I do. And I think there's probably a lot of ways it happens. And there's a lot of hypotheses for why it happens, and no one really knows for sure why it happens. But and I think some of the known ways are like there's something called like mirror migration, where like some of the austral breeders, which are the breeders that breed down in like South America, and then they winter in like the Amazon, they'll just keep going north after their winter. And then they'll end up maybe in the US. Like you'll have like a fork-tailed flycatcher that's supposed to be going down south to Patagonia, and instead it ends up in Missouri for no reason. And so there'll be like those mirror migrants. I think yellow-green vireo is an example of a mirror migrant that shows up sometimes in Santa Barbara. And then, there's like all kinds of ways it happens. But sometimes like seabirds will get blown off course, or shorebirds, or even songbirds with like some tropical storm. So I think there's all sorts of ways it happens. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, well, anything else in the room for Alex? Anything else in Zoom for Alex? Right. Okay, well, thank you very much, Alex. I really enjoyed this talk. Thank you for sharing it. Please go out and find more cool birds.
Yeah. Do you want me to
You're getting
give like
applause in the room.
do you want me to
What were
give
you
like
saying?
a final last piece of advice, like
Oh,
little
yeah,
tip?
yeah, yeah. So tell me, like,
I was just
on the subject of difficult IDs, what is your advice?
Yeah, so I'd say there's a couple things that like I do that I think helps me a lot. Is one, I keep track of like people are seeing in like other counties, what people are seeing around me. And that gives me an idea of things to keep an eye out for. And I always look into like the ID feature, so I always get myself like a little bit of an idea of how to look for those kinds of birds. That's one. Two, try to keep track of like if there's a species I'm looking for, like when it should show up. For example, the swift that Peter Schneekloth put on the listserv today. Um, if you look at Chatura records for Chimney and Vox's swift, I would recommend looking up those Chatura records, because if you look at their timelines, you'll see what is most likely, and it could be pretty exciting. And so there's that. And then obviously, as we'd mentioned, birding with other people and sending photos to other people and talking to other people and discussing these ideas with other people is super helpful. And if you're unsure, just like quickly send a photo to somebody, and you'll probably get like having other opinions is like so helpful for these things.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can certainly echo that. Like photography has just revolutionized how I approach birding because I can, have Paul Lehman look at the bird I saw and tell me like, yeah, no, this is this other thing, which is really, really helpful.
And
okay, well,
last thing,
again,
never
what's that,
count
Alex?
any possibility.
Yeah, bird every bird. And okay, well, thank you again, Alex. I really appreciate it. We're going to take a short break, maybe 2-3 minutes, and we're going to eat cookies in the room. Sorry, you on Zoom. We don't have Zoom support for cookie sharing. Maybe you have cookies at your location. And I'm going to mute the mic, but again, 2 minutes, I'll unmute and we'll get going with Flycatchers in part 2. So thank you. I want to talk about Flycatchers now. Okay, well, hello, everybody. Welcome again. We're still the same meeting. We're going to talk about Flycatchers now in part 2 of the meeting. So I need to share my screen, which again, we'll go over here. And I will find the right tab and I will go into slideshow mode. Okay, so if you on Zoom are seeing a lovely Says Phoebe, give me a thumbs up. Did that work? Thumbs up. All right, excellent. Okay, so we're going to talk about Flycatchers. And it's great that you're still here, Alex, by the way. If you have insight on the Flycatchers, definitely jump in and share. And again, anybody else, we're pretty informal. If you want to unmute and just shout it out, or if you want to say something in chat, we have Tom monitoring the Zoom meeting. So you can relay questions if you want to make them that way. The Zoom meeting controls, you mean? Yeah, can I hide those? I think I can hide them. Hide floating meeting controls. There we go. How's that? Is that better? Okay. Great. So Flycatchers. We're going to talk about Flycatchers. So here's a bunch of different Flycatchers. I'm gonna, yeah, we're gonna obscure part of the screen. I didn't want to do it that way. I'm being silly. Let's drag this over here. Maybe not. It's not doing it that way. How about like this? Yeah, I like that. Okay. So here's a bunch of different Flycatchers. And I'm just going to talk about sort of general Flycatcher characteristics. They have a relatively large head. So there's a certain sort of Flycatcher profile, silhouette that you learn and you kind of come to recognize. So, I mean, not an enormous head, but, on the big side for a little songbird of this size. They have this sort of characteristic upright posture. They kind of perch in this, I don't know, like, again, looking at the silhouettes of birds, you come to kind of recognize like, oh, that's a Flycatcher posture. That's just, they kind of sit upright like that. The beak is always super important if you're trying to identify, a bird that you don't know and you want to kind of zoom in on, what family it might be in. So Flycatcher beaks from the side look relatively thin, like they almost look like a big version of a warbler's beak. But in fact, why did I get the meeting controls back? I don't know. Probably press something. Oh, because there's someone who needs to be admitted, but you're handling that, right?
No. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. Jumped ahead. Jumped ahead again. Okay. So they the Flycatcher beak, if you see it from above or below, it's actually kind of triangular. It's sort of wide and flattened, but from the side, it looks pretty narrow. So it's sort of this interesting shape it has. Presumably, this is helpful for it to catch insects. They're called Flycatchers because they do in fact catch flying insects. They will sally out from a perch, an exposed perch, and they'll often like fly out from the same perch and then back and then out and back, which is very cool if you're a bird watcher because you can actually get a look at them. Some birds just kind of disappear into the underbrush and you never get a good look at them, but Flycatchers are relatively observable, which is very nice. Some of the species have behavioral things that are helpful, like they will pump their tail or flick their wings. They have certain characteristic movements that they make. And then again, one thing that flycatchers tend to share is they have relatively characteristic vocalizations. And this gets into like the difference between what are called sub-oscine and oscine birds. So in the perching birds, you can divide them up into two groups. And I don't want to get too far into it because I'm not that knowledgeable and I would just be talking piffle. But if you as a bird watcher, you're familiar with the taxonomic order, the order in which the families are laid out in your field guide. And that tends to reflect current thinking about when those families emerged through the evolutionary process. So the birds that show up earlier are the lineages that have been around the longest, and then the groups that show up later in the field guide are the ones that emerged later over evolutionary time. The perching birds, the passerines, are like the whole second half of the field guide, right? So those are all sort of recent arrivals on the bird scene, relatively speaking. And the flycatchers are kind of towards the beginning of that. So, and again, those perching birds, you can divide them up into the sub-oscine species, which in the Americas is mainly flycatchers. There's a lot of other sub-oscine groups in other parts of the world. And then there are the oscine species. And one of the main differences between them is that the oscine species have more complex syrinxes. So birds make their vocalizations with a structure called a syrinx. It's sort of the analog to our larynx, our voice box. And oscine species have more complex syrinxes, and they produce more complex and varied vocalizations. And oscine species tend to learn their vocalizations, like they will learn their song as they're growing up around other members of their species that are singing. And this is a really interesting fact. It means there tends to be greater variety, like even within that species. As you go from place to place, there will be like regional dialects, like a common yellowthroat singing in Southern California might have a different sounding song than a common yellowthroat in Missouri. So sub-oscines, however, don't do that so much. They're more like their songs are innate, like they are born and they make their song, and it's basically the same. So you tend to hear the same song from a ash-throated flycatcher wherever you come across it. Like they all just make that one song. So this is really helpful for identification, especially when they look really similar to other members of their family. You can use the vocalization. So this is why it was unfortunate that Alex's possible Nuttings flycatcher did not vocalize, because one, good, call note, you probably could have settled the question right then and there. And I just threw this photo in because I thought it was fun. So they mainly eat insects, but they will also eat fruit at times. Like this is a Cassin's kingbird that was eating berries, from a hedge near a sycamore that it was perched in, and it was tossing them and gobbling them down and having a great old time. So yeah, and I just want to talk in a little bit of generic terms, like the strategy for identifying flycatchers. Because I personally have found flycatcher identification can be pretty challenging. One of the things that I think is probably related to the fact that they have these very distinctive vocalizations is they're not always as visually distinctive. Like they can find their mates. They can maintain their species boundaries by not being confused and trying to mate with the wrong species, even though they look the same, because they all sound different. And maybe with other groups of birds, there might be more of an evolutionary process that tends to make them look distinctive, not so much with some of these flycatcher groups. So this is a factor in trying to identify them, and why some of the groups especially can be pretty tricky. And so I want to talk about just what I used to do and then what I do now, and contrast them. So when I started out as a bird watcher, I was, 9, 10, 11 years old. And I had this basic approach of, well, I'm just going to see the bird, I'm going to match it to the picture in my book, and that's how I'm going to know what it is. So I went through this process of plumage was very important. I was very interested in the plumage. And then maybe I'd maybe look at like the shape of the bird and the structure of the bird, like how long are the wings, or is it the right shape? What does the beak look like? And yeah, if it was vocalizing, and if I knew, if it was a bird I was familiar with, where I could recognize that, I would factor that in. And then finally, I'd think about sort of status and distribution. I'd like look in the field guide, well, is this species in the right place according to the maps in my field guide? And these are all important things to look at, but I think I had the hierarchy wrong because I think it's more important to do it this way, which is what I do now, where status and distribution is my starting point. Like I want to really know what birds, what species of this group do I expect to be around here right now? And that doesn't mean it has to just be them. Like as Alex's experience demonstrates, there could be stuff that's not supposed to be here that's here, but you still kind of need to know that because you need to know if the bird you think it might be is special and rare, because if it is, you really want to focus on it and gather as much information as you can. You don't just dismiss it. You just go, oh yeah, another, ash-throated flycatcher and move on, which is again, what I would probably have done. So status and distribution, I think, is very important to begin with as a piece of information. And then with flycatchers, voice, it turns out, is really key. If they're vocalizing at all, that's a gold mine of identification information. You really want to pay attention to that. If you've got Merlin Sound ID on your phone, that's good. If you can just make a recording with your phone and compare it to recordings later, that's very helpful. And then structure, very important. The length of the wing on these like Impidinax flycatchers, like this one in the screen, how much do the primaries extend out from the secondaries on the wing, on the folded wing? How broad or narrow or long or short is the beak? These structural things are really important. And then plumage too. Like you can't, there are clues to be seen in the plumage. But again, unlike the way I started off as a birder, where I sort of thought, oh, what colors are where on the bird is the thing to pay attention to. With flycatchers especially, it's not necessarily the most important thing. In fact, in some ways, it's the least important thing. All right, so I thought that was interesting. Okay, so we're going to talk about, what am I going to talk about here? Oh yeah, so now we're going to go to specific species that are pretty regularly seen in Santa Barbara. And again, I'm not showing all of them. I'm just kind of showing the highlights. These are the birds, you can reasonably expect to see in Santa Barbara if you're fairly active as a birder, and you don't need to find super rare birds in order to see these. But there are other ones out there. But these are the ones you should sort of start off by knowing, because most of the flycatchers you see around here will be in this group. So we got 3 species of kingbirds, 2 species of phoebes, 3 in a grab bag I just kind of threw together as miscellaneous mid-sized. And then Impidinax, and I talk about 3 different Impidinax species. There are more, but I talk about 3 of them. And then there's actually one bonus bird that I threw in, because when I first made these slides for a talk a few years ago, for some reason I didn't include this bird, and that was crazy. It's a great bird, so I threw it in at the end so we can talk about it. So we'll start by talking about kingbirds. So here's the status and distribution information from eBird for these 3 kingbird species that can be seen in Santa Barbara County. And you can see that, the percentage of checklists with these birds varies over the course of the year. Cassins, we pretty much have all year long. In the summertime, if you're in the right part of the county, good chance you can see Western kingbird. In the, fall and winter and spring, if you're in the right areas, there's a smaller, but still, decent chance you can see a tropical kingbird. And those are basically your 3 kingbirds you can expect to find. They look like this. In the interest of time, I'm not going to click out, like all of these are links and they go to the eBird page for each species. And I was thinking if we had time, I would go out there and I would play recordings of what they sound like. You're welcome to do that yourself. I'd certainly, again, encourage you to check out the sounds these birds make, but I'm going to skip it for now, just in the interest of pace and moving through this quickly. So the Cassin's kingbird, again, the one that we have all year round. These are the ones I see in Carpinteria every morning when I'm out walking my dog, getting my daily eBird checklist in. They are relatively dark gray in this area compared to, say, a Western kingbird, which is the one next to it here, which is lighter in that area. And then they have this light malar area, like below the base of the beak, the sort of chin area. So you get sort of a contrasty white patch there, and then this darker gray around that. And that's a useful thing to look for. The other thing that you can look for if you have a good look is the Western kingbird has these white outer tail feathers, and it's not always obvious, but if they are flying and turning in front of you and spread their tail, you can see it better. The Cassin's kingbird does not really have that, although at times they can look a little faded on the edges, so don't trick yourself. What the Cassin's has typically is this sort of faded tip of the tail, so almost like a light band at the end of the tail. Again, it's a subtle feature. It's not always going to be obvious. And then again, the Western kingbird next to it, which is similar to the Cassins, but sort of lighter in this area and with those white outer tail feathers. And then the tropical kingbird, which is really cool. I've read, discussions that I think it was Paul Lehman. If you read his account in Birds of Santa Barbara County, I think this might be where I saw this. I don't want to misquote him, but someone I was reading was talking about, they think that historically there probably were more tropical kingbirds in Santa Barbara County that were not in the winter months, that were not being reported. Like people just assumed they were Cassins kingbirds. But if you learn to look carefully, they're pretty distinctive. They have a longer, heavier beak than the Cassins kingbird. They tend to show this kind of more forked tail, although, that kind of is variable and it depends on how they're holding their tail, and the other species can show that too in the right angles. But then another thing that's really helpful is the yellow extends up into the breast area, whereas on both of these other kingbird species, it really kind of cuts off at the boundary between the belly and the breast. And again, it's a subtle difference, but when you learn to look specifically for it, it does stand out. And they sound completely different. So learn what they sound like. So those are your kingbirds. And, for Western and tropical, for Carpinteria birders, if you're out there and you see a kingbird at this time of year, certainly it's probably a Cassins. But, check in the eBird records, and, there are places where you see Western. I saw a Western kingbird up at Lake Los Carneros, just a week or so ago. There's a few of them up there. Not really the right time of year for tropical kingbird, but when they're around, there'll be ones or twos in certain places, and you can go there. And again, they're flycatchers, so they're kind of out there where you can see them. They're very chaseable birds. If you find a record for a flycatcher that you're interested in seeing, go where it was seen, because there's a good chance you could see it too. Now we're going to move on to phoebes. And I think the Say's phoebe could be my favorite bird. They were nice enough to do a profile of Carp Birdwatchers and me in Carpinteria magazine, and they asked me for my favorite bird, and I was like, snowy plover, which is also my favorite bird. I have multiple favorite birds, but I think in thinking about it, Say's phoebe might actually qualify. So black phoebe, one of the most commonly seen, probably the most commonly seen flycatcher in Santa Barbara County. Real thick green band here. They live in suburbia where bird watchers are. We see them all the time. You go walk around Carpinteria, you will probably see a black phoebe. And then Say's phoebe, not as much in the summer months, but in the winter, more frequently. But again, they are out there if you go to the right places. I think they were breeding up at North Campus Open Space. So there's certain spots where you can walk around up there and see Say's phoebe and see the juvenile Say's phoebes. And they're very cute. Here's what they look like. Refreshingly easy to ID by my 11-year-old self's approach, because they just look different. They've got, different colors in different places on their body from the other flycatchers you're going to see around here typically. So the black phoebe, it's black on top with this sort of cool white underparts. Say's phoebe, this kind of really pretty brownish on top with this sort of salmon colored underparts. They pump their tails, so I was talking about behavioral cues. If you see a bird, a flycatcher out there pumping its tail, think about maybe it's a phoebe. Yeah, black and Say's. And then my grab bag of miscellaneous mid-sized flycatchers. So these are all flycatchers you're really only likely to see here in the summertime or during migration. They tend to hang out in certain specific habitats. So again, look in eBird to find out where to find them. They are breeding in the county, but you kind of have to go to the right places to find them, like olive-sided. In fact, I think the olive-sided and the Western are pretty much up in the mountains. Alex, you can jump in. I'm sort of getting out of my depth here in terms of trying to describe specifically where to go see these. I know where I've seen them, but I don't know how definitive that information is.
I mean, yeah, can you hear me?
Keep talking.
Yeah. Okay, so olive-sided, yeah, I would agree with you. It's more of a montane thing. Wood pewee you can get also montane, but they're also in the riparian areas more than olive-sided is.
Yeah. Okay, so and we'll take a look at them. So here is the olive-sided and the Western wood pewee and the ash-throated, which you will recognize as the possible Nuttings flycatcher. So the olive-sided is kind of cool because I was talking about the big head kind of characteristic of flycatchers. olive-sided takes it to the extreme. It's got this like ginormous head and this little tail, and it just looks like a very disproportionate bird, you know, compared to what I'm used to seeing. Has a really cool vocalization. It goes, quick 3 beers. So you're up there in the mountains, you hear this bird going, quick 3 beers. I told my daughter that when she was growing up, and she thought I was lying. And then when she actually heard it, she was like, oh my gosh, it really goes quick 3 beers. But they're very cool. Up in the mountains is where I know we had that fire, right? The is it the lake fire? Yeah, that burned through like the East Pinery area. I mean, there was some olive-sided flycatchers up there going quick 3 beers 2 weeks ago, and I'm not sure they're still there because it's sort of a smoking wasteland right now. All right, and then Western wood pewee, kind of a overall kind of dark flycatcher. For a longest time, and still probably today, I tend to confuse them with Epidionax flycatchers, the group we're going to look at next. They are different, and structurally they're different. This very long wing, like you can't really see it very well in this photo, but their wing is really long. And as with most, like with a lot of migratory birds, the length of the wing tends to correlate with the distance that they migrate. And I guess Western wood pewees migrate long distances because they've got really long wings. And then the ash-throated flycatcher, which again is part of this Miarchus genus, a whole bunch of very similar, like in terms of the color patterns, you know, they all basically have the same pattern. They've got this kind of gray underneath and this kind of reddish on the wings and maybe some reddish in the tail, and a little bit of yellow on the belly and then grayer up here. There was a great crested flycatcher, another Miarchus species that was at Seaside Gardens just right down the road here a few years ago that I got to see. And again, it was striking to me like, oh wow, that looks so much like an ash-throated flycatcher. You know, a little bit bigger, a little scaled up, a few subtle differences, and certainly learn those subtle differences if you like, you know, want to be like Alex and pick out the really cool ones from all the regular ones. But we see them up in the chaparral. Like if you hike up the Franklin Trail, I think that's a good place to see ash-throated flycatcher. And we'll go on to Epidionax. And I was lazy. I'm only going to talk about 3 Epidionax flycatchers, but I just copy and pasted the whole chunk from the eBird histograms for this group. The ones I'm going to talk about are the Western flycatcher, which is by far the most frequently seen in Santa Barbara County of these Epidionax flycatchers. Was until recently called the Pacific Slope flycatcher because it was split from the eastern population that was the Cordilleran flycatcher. And then the people who decide these things decided that was a mistake. So they said, well, we're going to unsplit them. We're going to lump them. So they've been lumped back together. So if you had Cordilleran flycatcher and Pacific Slope flycatcher on your life list, I'm sorry to tell you, you only have one species on your life list now. And it is called the Western flycatcher. But that made me feel good because when I was growing up, that's what it was. So I was happy to see it come back. So that's the one we tend to see, like certainly around carp right now. Willow flycatcher is more a migratory occurrence. Like you see it in the spring migration and you see it again in the fall migration, but outside of that, not so much. And then the other one I talk about is Hammond's flycatcher, which is even tougher to see. Again, kind of in spring migration is when you're going to have a good chance of seeing a Hammond's. Well, you're going to have a chance. I didn't say a good chance. They're hard. I have spent a lot of time trying to see a Hammond's flycatcher and failing. So I have sort of a negative view about the findability of Hammond's flycatcher in the county. I have seen them, but it took a lot of work. And then the other ones I'm not going to talk about. They are findable. You know, if you're into you get excited about the chasing down rarities. You know, again, when you hear a report of one of these birds, get in your car and go there because they're findable. You know, they're going to stick around hopefully for a little while. And they're going to be out in the open doing their flycatcher thing. All right, so here are 3 Epidionax flycatchers. How could you possibly confuse those birds? They're so different looking, right? So there is our Western flycatcher on the left. Things to look for, it's got more of a pronounced teardrop effect on the eye ring with this sort of, you know, bigger bulge in the eye ring on the back part of the eye. Kind of a medium to largish beak. Primary extension is very important. So how far the primary feathers on the folded wing extend past the secondaries. And in the Western flycatcher, medium, shortish to medium primary extension. And there's other characteristics. There's actually a really cool book that Ty Birch and someone just came out with just a field guide just on Impidinax flycatchers and peewees, I think, but mostly about.
If I
Yeah.
can,
Alex, you were gonna say something?
It's a book by Sin T. Lee and Andrew Birch. Is that the one you're talking about?
That's what I meant. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I was going to bring it as a visual aid and then I forgot. But it talks about a whole bunch of other features. They have a whole matrix of Impidinax features that they talk about. So there's the eye ring, there's the primary length, there's the forehead angle. It turns out to be really useful. So if you look at the angle that the top of the beak and the forehead makes, like this is a fairly shallow angle, and this is a fairly shallow angle, but this bird has a steeper angle. These things, these subtle differences turn out to actually be really useful. And again, if you can get them to vocalize, you definitely want to take advantage of that. And these are really small. I didn't really mention that, but Impidinax flycatchers are the little bitty ones, right? So when you see a little flycatcher, maybe dipping its tail, flicking its wings, doing its little flycatcher thing, think Impidinax. The willow flycatcher, similar to the Western, browner. The willow is more olivey, and the Western is more olivey, and the willow is sort of browner. A lot less eye ring, and there's individual variations from bird to bird, even within the species. So these are sort of averages. Again, kind of a medium-sized beak, kind of medium to short primary projection. Tail shape is also a factor I'm not even going to talk about. There are lots of little things to look at. And then finally, this one down the corner, this is my nemesis, the Hammond's flycatcher. And the thing that makes it really one of the things that distinguishes it is it's got a tiny little beak. If you look at just the size of this beak compared to these other two empids, it's very, very small, all dark beak. Right? And its primary extension is relatively long. So again, it wouldn't jump out at you if you weren't looking for it, but once you're looking for it, it really does jump out. If you look at the primary extension on this bird compared to each of these two birds, its primaries stick out a lot more, like noticeably more. So that's a good thing to look for if you're trying to find a Hammond's flycatcher. I think that gets us to our bonus bird, which I just think is the coolest bird. So this is a vermilion flycatcher, and this is a sub-adult male that was hanging out on the beach at Carpinteria for like 3 or 4 months. It was just great. You could go down to the mouth of Carpinteria Creek and it was always there. And this is the adult male. That's just an amazing bird. It's one of those birds that, when I was growing up and learning to bird and looking at my field guide, I would come to this bird in the field guide and be like, oh yeah, no, that's not real. That could not really exist. I wouldn't expect. If I saw that bird, I would be so amazed. And it's true. When I finally saw that bird, I was very amazed. It's like, wow, it really looks like that. It's like when you're in the supermarket and there's a celebrity, like, I guess a certain very high level celebrity wouldn't be caught in the supermarket. But like if you come across a mid-range celebrity in the supermarket, like, whoa, there's that person. They really look like that. That's how I feel about the vermilion flycatcher. Here is its eBird histogram for Santa Barbara County. It's tough to find. Like, again, there's certain places where they hang out and, the word gets around, among the birders, like Jack O'Connell Park, right, in Guadalupe, just west of Santa Maria, has had 1 or 2 vermilion flycatchers hanging out there at least the last couple of winters. And it's very much worth the trip to go there and see a bird like this because it's amazing. Okay. That I think is it for birds. That's it for our flycatchers. I'm going to stop the screen share. I see there is some commentary in the chat. And I see I've also pinned Alex, which I didn't mean to do. There we go. Anything I need to see? Oh, Alex has helpfully given a list to the Empidinax and Cantopus field guide. So that's great. Yeah, check out that field guide if you want to, just curl up with a book and read about how to identify those empids. And and I need to get their second volume, the one about the Miarchus and the kingbirds. Yeah, definitely worth getting. Okay. All right, so that was just kind of me motor mouthing. I apologize for being that way. Questions, feedback, commentary? This is your chance before we adjourn for more cookies. Cookies are really good. Tom was running down these cookies and they're really good. That's why I wasn't taking questions and going really fast because I want to finish this cookie.
Any chance on the 8th Street Bridge, where we can see this on?
Yeah, so will we see flycatchers at the 8th Street Bridge? I think there is an excellent chance we will be able to see or hear, or both, a black phoebe. I haven't been there in a few months myself. I mean, it would be a good spot for a black phoebe. A decent chance for a Western flycatcher. Learn what they sound like, and then you will hear that, and you'll go, "Oh, I hear that all the time when I'm in this place." It's your Western flycatcher you could hear. Any other flycatchers we might get down there? I don't know. Like, I've been pretty lazy about birding Carpinteria Creek this summer. Like, I mean, it's a great spot in the fall and winter, but it's a great spot all the time, and I should bird there more. And I just haven't been there. You know, I've been complaining to anyone who will listen about how we have this fun puppy, and the puppy is great, and he needs to be walked every morning. And I'm, you know, getting up in the morning, so I'm helping out by walking the puppy. But it does cut into my birding obsession a little bit. I bird while I walk the puppy, but it's not the same as being able to like take the camera and go in there and really, you know, check out the birds. But it makes me appreciate it more when I actually do it.
Yeah, Merlin keeps picking up a Western flycatcher at our house in the backyard.
Yeah, and so you're hearing Merle. Yeah, you've got a Western fly. They're probably breeding in Carpinteria Creek right behind your house.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
There's so many birds, I haven't been able to find it, but
Yeah, well, they're small, but you know, if you follow up that sound, go bushwhack through the poison oak and see if you can find the Western flycatcher. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. Please come out on Saturday, and Alex, it might be more of a haul for you to get down to Carpinteria on Saturday, but thank you for joining us virtually, and we'll see you all next month. I see thanks in the chat, so yes, I'm sure those go to Alex as much as anyone, if not more. So thank you, Alex, again. And we will see you all on Saturday or at next month's meeting or whenever.
thank you. Great.